Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
Cuba was once the front line. The missile crisis between the US and the Soviet Union was the closest we ever came to thermonuclear, mutually assured destruction of the human race. Trust me, I remember it. It felt like humanity was going to end before the 60s had even got swinging.
Decades of US invasion, subversion, assassination, and Florida-based terrorism against Cuba ensued. But the US could not make Cuba kneel down and cry Uncle Sam.
So it seems they've given up and decided to make love, not war, with Cuba. Or have they? Joining us now to discuss this and other Cuba matters is Bob Oram of the Cuba Solidarity Campaign. Bob, thanks for joining us on the Sputnik. On the subject of terrorism and the Cuba Solidarity Campaign, you recently secured a signal victory in the battle of words with the Metropolitan Police in Operation Strong Tower. Tell us about that.
Well, Strong Tower was a massive trial terrorist operation that the Metropolitan Police staged, and for some reason they decided 3 of the actors who were portraying themselves as terrorists on that day, one of them wore a Cuba T-shirt with a Cuban flag on it. We received loads and loads of complaints, not only from members, but from members of the public. And we immediately wrote to the Metropolitan Police, and we did receive a written response which says that it clearly was a regrettable error. I think I'm not 100% convinced by that, because I don't understand why something that was 6 months in the planning actually went ahead with somebody. 2 of the 3 were dressed purely in black balaclavas, black clothes.
Yeah.
One of them was wearing a Cuban flag T-shirt. Now, you would have thought that somebody would have looked at that person and said, that is wrong, because any country's national flag would be wrong to wear in that situation. What the Met said, and they've not put it on their website or put out a press release when they said it, but they said it was the person didn't think of the significance and the implications of wearing a T-shirt with a national flag on it. It was a gross blunder, but it was a cruel irony on that day as well, because on that day, for a start, the World Health Organization announced that Cuba had found a cure for mother-to-baby transmission of syphilis and HIV. That should have been the news that was being reported. It was only a month after the US had removed them from the list of state sponsors of terrorism, a list which they'd been on as a vile and disgraceful slur against Cuba for 33 years and 2 months. So having achieved that victory of getting them removed from that list of terrorism, then the Cubans find themselves portrayed in this way across the media. And it was only by our efforts that the police, and we welcome the apology, but...
Well, it's not the most fulsome apology. No. If I become the mayor, I'll get a better one for you. But Cuba is in the news now, a lot. And it's in the news because, as we said in the introduction, we might be about to enter a new era. How does the Cuba Solidarity Campaign see that prospect?
Well, I mean, the raising the flagpole doesn't resolve the whole problem.
This is the US flag in Havana and the Cuban flag in Washington.
Well, they haven't raised the flag in Havana yet, but the one in Washington has gone up. But that doesn't resolve things. This is clearly a process, not an event, and it's going to take some time because there are a number of substantial issues still to be resolved to achieve that normalisation of relations. I mean, obviously, the financial, the commercial, the economic blockade that they've waged against Cuba has to end.
And it doesn't end automatically as a result of this.
No, no. And it doesn't end because part of the things that are happening are Obama's responsibility. He can do them, but some things can't. The Cuban Democracy Act, the Helms-Burton Act, enshrines in American law the fact that there can be no normalization of relations with Cuba until Cuba has adopted democracy. And you know, whose version of democracy?
Yeah,
And,
exactly.
you know, democracy on what basis? So that's got to end. There's the thorny problem of the illegal military base and prison that's on Guantanamo Bay. Last month there was the House massively increased the multi-million-dollar programs that are used from America to fund internal destabilization or activities against Cuba. They also increased the TV Marty and Radio Marty, which broadcasts anti-Cuban propaganda against the country. So there's a whole range of things, not least the compensation that should be looked at in terms of the suffering and the damage that has been done to Cuba over the last 50 years and more because of the blockade. So I think everybody welcomes that this has happened. They certainly welcomed the 17th of December announcement in Cuba, and you know, that much is clear. But this is not the end of the process by a long stretch. All they've done is change the strategy, but the objectives are still the same. They want to create a client capitalist state in their backyard that ipso facto loses its own sovereignty as part of that process.
Yeah, but Fidel or Raul, in their case, would not allow that, right?
No, I don't think they will, and I don't think the Cuban people will either. I think they've long understood that this is going to happen in some form or another. And Obama has had to seize this moment with the release of the three remaining members of the five. He's had to seize this moment because he could ignore the UN vote of condemnation of the blockade every year. That didn't bother them. But what's really bothered them is they're being ostracized in their own backyard. All the American states and the Organization of American States has been anti them now since 2012. They can't do anything without the issue of Cuba being raised. So they've had to change their tactic, and what Obama said was we're throwing off the shackles. That hasn't worked, but we're pivoting towards a policy of engagement. And they will try, as you said, to have that engagement on their terms. The Cubans, I think, and they're great negotiators. They've won all the discussions so far. They're great negotiators, and I think they'll be resolute in their determination to ensure the end of the blockade, Guantanamo coming back, and, you know, stopping even an embassy interfering in the internal affairs of a sovereign nation state, because that's what the special interest section did. If they're normalising relations, then it has to be normal relations that every other country gets in the world. And it should be no different for Cuba.
At the very same time as President Obama was engaging with Cuba, of course, and taking Cuba, as you pointed out, off the list of states that supposedly sponsor terrorism, he put Venezuela on that list and stepped up sanctions against Venezuela. This is such an obvious paradox, contradiction. It's difficult to see how it hasn't been more widely noticed.
Good point, George. I mean, I think it has been covered in some press, but not, you know, and I think we work very closely with the Venezuela Solidarity Campaign, and that's a message that we are intent on getting out and sharing widely. As I said, you know, Venezuela's not had that tactic tried on it, so they are trying it. Cuba's had it tried for so long, they're looking for a different.
Yes. I had the privilege of visiting for some extended time Vietnam and meeting with the leaders of Vietnam, one of whom said to me, when you open the doors and the windows, the light comes in, but so do the flies. There are many flies, just itching to get back to Cuba. The Cuban emigres who ran away after the revolution, taking as much of their ill-gotten gains as they could with them. The fanatics who want to score an ideological victory. The gangsters who used to run Cuba, the mafia and so on, as a kind of bordello and casino. And of course, normal capitalism, McDonald's, drive-ins and so on. When you project forward, to what extent do you see the balance between the light coming in, end of the blockade and so on, and the flies that come in with it?
The light's been on for a while now. I mean, people say about there's going to be an influx of Americans. Well, there's 2 million visitors from North America, from Canada, to Cuba each year. You often hear the voices on the beach and think that they are Americans. It's not like Cubans haven't seen tourists before and there haven't been engagements with the private sector. The Cubans have done it on their terms, though, and I think that's important. And the new economic guidelines that they passed in a couple of years ago have recognised that there have to be changes. And you know, no socialist society can exist without a productive economy. You need that, as Marx said, to build the social consumption fund to fuel your health services and your education services and everything else that you do as a good state.
Which is outstanding in their case.
Yes, yes. And they need some more investment. They need some more help with developing some of their industries. And they will take in the private sector. But on their terms. And I think, you know, we have to trust them to know how they want to do that, having looked at Vietnam and having looked at China and having looked at other countries around the world. The one thing that the Cubans won't do is simply fall into America's hands. They've learnt the lesson in one sense with, you know, the sad demise of the Soviet Union. They had to go through totally restructuring their economy. What they will have in the future is a range of countries in which they trade with, so that they've got a basket of currencies and economies to do business with. And I think there will be naturally a relations with their nearest neighbour, and there should be relations with their nearest neighbour, but it will be on their terms.
Bob Oram, Cuba Solidarity Campaign. Thanks for joining us on the Sputnik.
George.
Coming up after the break is a guest I once met in the street in Hiroshima. She's the General Secretary of CND. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Sputnik. The only state ever to drop a nuclear bomb was the state we've just been discussing, which insisted on its nuclear monopoly in its own hemisphere. The US bomb, which fell on Hiroshima, killed, eviscerated so many people, they decided to do it again 3 days later.
Even though Japan was in the process of surrendering, so horrified were right-thinking people around the world that a huge campaign to ban the bomb arose.
In the vanguard of that campaign was Britain's Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, CND, and its General Secretary joins us now to mark the 70th anniversary of Hiroshima. Kate Hudson, welcome to the Sputnik. Just for those who, for whom perhaps this was all very long ago, and that's most people, 70 years, kindly summarise what happened on the 6th and the 9th of August in 1945.
Well, on the 6th of August, a US Air Force plane dropped a single atom bomb on the city of Hiroshima, not on a military base, but on an enormous city. It was early in the morning with people going about their business, children going to school, and that single bomb created a devastating blast, a firestorm that immediately killed over 100,000 people. And then in the days and weeks that followed, hundreds of thousands more died from the consequences of radiation, but also from the complete breakdown of any kind of health care, food, water, sanitation or anything. And then, as you said, 3 days later, the United States did exactly the same thing, dropping a single bomb on Nagasaki. Again, a city, not a military installation. And again, hundreds of thousands of people died in that same terrifying pattern.
And this took us into a new era, didn't it? Because
absolutely.
it was the first weapon of mass destruction,
Yep.
unlimited in scope and time, because, of course, people were still being deformed and dying as a result of the radiation many years later. The second one cannot be defended even if the first one could, in that, as Gayatri said, Japan was already surrendering
That's
when
right.
it was dropped. But it was dropped for another reason, wasn't it? It was dropped to send a signal to other superpower, the only other superpower in the world, the Soviet Union, that things would never be the same again.
Yes, they were wanting to establish their military predominance, their nuclear predominance in the post-war situation. I mean, sadly, though, it appears that some evidence shows that the Americans were actually wanting to test 2 different types of bombs, so kind of human guinea pigs in Nagasaki, testing the different types of weaponry.
Except you'd never get away with massacring that many guinea pigs.
Well,
People
no,
would
no,
be,
absolutely, of course.
up in arms. Of course, you weren't around, neither was I at the time, but how drastic a change did it seem? How much more deadly, exponentially more deadly, did this new weaponry seem at the time?
Well, absolutely. I mean, it was a real sea change, a real turning point in weaponry. Obviously, many thousands of people, tens of thousands of people would be killed in air raids and bombing and so on. And of course, we saw the terrible losses on the battlefield, particularly in the Eastern Front. But the very fact of a single bomb having that kind of impact, but I think more uniquely, the radiological consequences.
Okay.
As you said, for decades later, people would still be dying from cancers, from birth deformities, and it wasn't something you could see. You know, the radiation could blow around, no one would know who was a victim of it, and that was a terrifying thing, completely new thing. You weren't just on the end of a physical weapon, you were at the mercy of something you couldn't see.
Well, we weren't around at the time, but we are, I'm afraid, old enough to have been veterans together in the decades of campaigning, so that this should never, could never happen again. But it could have, couldn't it? We've just been discussing Cuba. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, the United States was ready to plunge the world into a nuclear winter from which humankind might not have survived. But we avoided that, I would argue, through good negotiating between Kennedy and Khrushchev, but it was a close-run thing. And then they brought their own nuclear weapons to Britain, having said that it was unacceptable that there should be nuclear weapons on Cuba. They brought them here, not 90 miles away from here, but here. And that's when CND, as it were, got a second wind, a second life. What do you recall of that particular campaign in the 80s?
Well, the 80s, as you say, it was a second wind for CND. It was a huge upsurge, a spontaneous upsurge, not just organised through CND, but many local town, village groups, even street groups against cruise missiles. Because what we all understood, as you'll remember from the time, was that we knew this would be a war fought between the US and the Soviet Union in Europe. Those cruise missiles, they were intermediate range missiles, and they were precisely to be in Britain and in Europe, so the war could be fought here. And we all felt threatened with destruction. We all thought that we would die as a result of this terrible policy. So we had massive protests, hundreds of thousands of people. We had peace camps. I went to Greenham Peace Camp. Many people went to other peace camps to try and prevent that happening. So that kind of upsurge in popular sentiment, particularly pro-peace sentiment, was never seen again until the recent protests against the war on Iraq.
And yet, in Britain, it became a political consensus that your raison d'etre, the campaign for nuclear disarmament, was politically toxic, fatally so. So the Labour Party, which had been won to an anti-nuclear weapon position, abandoned that and learned to love nuclear weapons. Or did it? Because isn't one of the lessons of Jeremy Corbyn, our old comrade's fantastic leadership campaign, that actually, whilst the MPs might be ready to love Trident,
Yes.
the rank and file in society are not?
Absolutely. For at least a decade, since we've been closely watching the polls about the question of replacing Trident, the majority of the population has consistently been opposed to Trident. Not just opposed to replacing it, but actually in favour of scrapping it, whether or not anyone else scraps their nuclear weapons. So Jeremy Corbyn is absolutely 100% on message with the majority of the population. And that's what Labour, the Labour leadership, the people who are pro-Trident have to realise. It's not a vote loser to scrap Trident, it's a vote winner.
Not least because of the money.
Absolutely. £100 billion.
We're going to spend £100 billion on nuclear weapons we cannot use except as an act of national suicide.
Yeah.
When our public services and the workers that work within it are being squeezed to the point of expiring in some cases. We could be using that £100 billion for good things.
Yeah, we could help to regenerate our economy, create jobs in sustainable energy, for example, in house building, hospital building, school building, and these are the kinds of messages, of course, that we hear from Jeremy Corbyn, which is why he's so popular.
Yes, Mr. Ben used to say that the hospitals and schools are having to have flag days to raise money whilst nuclear weapons are getting the tax money.
Yeah.
Why don't we reverse that? Why don't we have a flag day, charity, rattling cans to pay for Trident and use the tax money for the public services?
Well,
I wonder how much would be raised. I wonder how many people would put money in a tin to buy more nuclear weapons.
They might get enough for a few nuts and bolts, George.
I think that's about it. Now, you've been commemorating as CND the 70th anniversary.
Absolutely, yeah.
You've held a series of events in London. What does the future look like for CND? Are you still growing? What kind of things are you doing? How can people watching this join up for the campaign?
Well, we are growing. We have many new young members. As you say, many people now feel distance from it. They don't understand the issues. But once we make people aware of the issues and the cost, of course, what we could spend it on instead, people become aware of what an absolute craziness it is to spend so much of our national resources on a weapon of mass destruction. So we have new people coming in. We've got very strong campaigning now in terms of Parliament. You'll be aware that next year there's supposed to be a vote in Parliament about whether or not Trident is replaced, and we're lobbying very strongly for a vote against that. We have to win the politicians and the so-called opinion formers to listen to ordinary people and make a decision against a further round of nuclear weapons. So
we could make that decision, couldn't we?
Yeah.
I mean, there are many people who are not on the left who recognise that actually the opportunity cost of making this further investment in nuclear weapons is felt not least by the poor infantry in the armed forces.
And we were there last year, remember, in Scotland, when we drove around the Trident base. It's humongous.
It's truly gigantic. And of course, it was one of the big issues in the Scottish independence referendum campaign.
No one wants it. No one in Scotland wants it.
No one in Scotland wants it, even those that voted no. So my point is that Trident can be stopped if Labour gives a lead. It may find an echo amongst even retired admirals and generals and so on, who think that, frankly, this is not the best use of £100 billion, not even in defence terms.
There are many military retired top brass, field marshals and generals, as you say, who describe Trident as completely useless, you know, militarily irrelevant, and say that it should be scrapped. So you're absolutely right. The opportunity cost in defence terms is troops could have boots, soldiers could have somewhere decent to live, they could look after the veterans, all kinds of ways in which it could be spent.
How do people join CND?
They go to our website, which is www.cnduk.org.
The very best of luck.
Thank you very much,
and
George.
many more years of campaigning.
Thank
Kate
you very
Hudson,
much. Thank
General
you.
Secretary of CND.
Thank you.
And now it's your turn to tell us what you think through the portals of social media. What's rattling, Gayatri?
On Cuba and the US, we asked, has the Cold War freezer finally thawed? Nobody answers. Within minutes, Cuba would go back to gangsterism of 1953 but with McDonald's Happy Meals. On Hiroshima, 70 years on, what has the world learned? Joe Cook observes the terrorist attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki are celebrated as necessary. So we've learned that the US and the West still control the narrative.
The first explosion, when the United States were still fighting island to island, you could make a military justification for, if not a moral one. But the second explosion cannot be justified on any count. It was a clear, either as Kate Hudson said, a guinea pig experiment, or it was a political message to others.
Jimmy the Fool says, we've learned America has a booming arms trade industry and loves war. And that's all that we've got for this week.
Which, alas, means that's the end of the show.
You can stay in touch with us on Twitter at RT_Sputnik or on Facebook, Sputnik on Russia Today. It's goodbye from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been marvellous.